The thermometer shattered at 110 degrees Fahrenheit with a sound like a gunshot. A single drop of sweat fell from Miller Calabro's brow and hit the broken glass at his feet, sizzling on contact with the sun-scorched rock. He'd been checking the temperature gauge mounted outside the general store when the mercury couldn't climb any higher. The glass just gave up, exploded, as if the heat itself had murdered it. "Miller," Dixie's voice cut through the shimmering air from their truck. "We need to go, now." He turned to look down into the valley where Oakhaven spread across the flats like a collection of kindling waiting for a match. The air above the town rippled and twisted, turning the wooden ranch houses into wavering mirages. You couldn't breathe out there anymore without feeling like you were inhaling liquid fire. The sky had turned a sick, bleached white, the color of bone left too long in the desert sun. "Come on," Dixie called again, one hand already on the door of their truck, her wide-brimmed hat casting the only shadow for miles. Miller grabbed the canteen from his belt and ran for the vehicle, his boots kicking up dust that hung in the dead, motionless air. As Dixie threw the truck into gear, he looked back one last time at the town that had spent 2 solid years calling them crazy. They were about to find out who the real fools were. The road up the mountain was a brutal, winding snake of gravel and switchbacks. Miller gripped the dashboard as Dixie navigated the hairpin turns, the truck's engine screaming in protest at the steep incline. Through the passenger window, he could see Oakhaven shrinking below them, the wooden structures already starting to blur at the edges from the heat distortion. "How bad is it going to get?" Dixie asked, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Miller pulled the folded weather report from his shirt pocket, the one he'd printed 3 days ago, when the meteorologists started using words like unprecedented and catastrophic. He didn't need to read it again. He'd memorized every horrifying detail. 7 days, he said quietly. Temperatures between 110 and 115. No cloud cover, no rain, no relief. My God. It's not God doing this. Then he saw it through the windshield, the blue arch. Even from 2 miles away, the ancient glacier glowed against the white peaks, like a sapphire set in platinum. The mouth of the ice cave they'd carved their home into looked cool and dark and impossibly inviting. Miller felt his chest loosen for the first time in hours. They were almost home. Dixie pulled the truck to a stop at the base of the glacier, where the road ended and the ice began. The temperature difference was immediate and shocking. Down in Oakhaven, the air had been a solid, suffocating thing. Up here, at the glacier's threshold, a breeze flowed out from the blue depths, carrying with it the smell of ancient frost and mineral cold water. Miller stepped out of the truck and walked toward the entrance. The archway they'd carved stood 20 feet high, the walls of 1,000-year-old ice glowing with that otherworldly blue light that came from ice so compressed it looked like frozen sky. Beyond the arch, he could see the corner of their log cabin, the structure everyone in Oakhaven had called Calabro's Icebox and the Death Trap, and a dozen other names, none of them kind. Dixie came to stand beside him, her red neckerchief bright against her plaid shirt, her expression as defiant as the day they'd first broken ground here. Or rather, broken ice. "They laughed at us," she said softly, staring down at the valley. "At the tavern, at the town meetings, at church. They said we'd freeze to death. They said the ice would crush us. They said we were building our own tomb." Miller pulled his wide-brimmed hat lower, shading his eyes from the brutal sun that beat down on everything except the mouth of their glacier home. "They said a lot of things. And now?" He looked down at Oakhaven one more time. Even from up here, he could see the shimmer of heat rising from the valley floor like steam from a kettle. The town's water tower stood like a skeleton against the bleached sky, already half empty according to the emergency broadcast they'd heard on the radio that morning. Now they're about to learn why a civil engineer doesn't just build where it's comfortable, Miller said. He builds where it's survivable. Dixie turned and started walking toward the blue archway, toward the cabin that glowed with warm lamplight deep inside the ice. Miller followed, feeling the temperature drop with every step they took into the glacier's embrace. Behind them, the sun continued its assault on the world. Ahead of them, The ancient ice held firm, unchanged by the fury raging just beyond its walls. The cabin door closed behind them with a solid, reassuring thunk. Inside, the temperature was a steady 55 degrees. The log walls they'd anchored into the ice radiated coolness. The spring water Miller had tapped during construction flowed into their cistern with a musical sound that was worth more than gold right now. Dixie removed her hat and hung it by the door, then moved to the window they'd installed facing the valley. It was real glass, triple-paned, hauled up the mountain at enormous expense. Through it, Oakhaven looked small and fragile and terribly, terribly exposed. "How long before they come?" she asked. Miller joined her at the window. "Day 3, maybe day 4, when their wells run dry and their air conditioning fails, when the first person dies from heat stroke. And what do we do when they arrive?" That was the question, wasn't it? The people who'd tried to run them out of town, who'd called them insane, who'd made Dixie cry more than once with their cruelty. Those same people would come up this mountain begging for the salvation they'd mocked. Miller looked around their Glacier home, at the mathematical precision of every log, every anchor point, every ventilation shaft he'd designed to keep this place stable, even under the stress of extreme heat. He'd built more than a house. He'd built a lifeboat. "We'll see," he said finally. "We'll see who they are when the heat strips everything else away." Outside, the sun climbed higher. The thermometer they'd left at the glacier entrance read 112 degrees at ground level. But inside the ancient blue ice, in the cabin everyone had called a folly, Miller and Dixie Calabro stood in the cool shadows and waited for the world below to burn. This was only day 1. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The interior of the Glacier cabin smelled like pine and cold stone, and the faint mineral tang of ice that had been frozen since before humans walked these mountains. Miller stood at the window, watching the heat distortion turn Oakhaven into a watercolor painting that kept running and bleeding at the edges. Dixie moved through their home with practiced efficiency, checking water levels, adjusting the ventilation shafts Miller had carved into the ice ceiling, ensuring the thermal balance he'd calculated so carefully remained stable. "We should eat something," she said, though neither of them was particularly hungry. The stress of watching a disaster unfold did that to your appetite. Miller turned from the window and sat at their handmade table, the surface smooth from countless evenings of meal preparation and blueprint review. Dixie set down 2 plates of cold chicken and bread, food that would stay fresh in the glacier's natural refrigeration without any effort on their part. She poured water from their cistern into 2 metal cups, and the sound of it made Miller think of all the faucets in Oakhaven that were probably running dry right about now. "You're thinking about the town council meeting," Dixie said, reading his expression the way she always could. Miller took a sip of water, ice cold and pure. "Hard not to. Tell me again," she said softly. "I need to remember why we're up here and they're down there." Miller leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to that night 18 months ago, when he'd walked into the Oakhaven town hall with a leather portfolio full of engineering diagrams and enough conviction to move mountains. Or in his case, to carve a home out of one. The council chamber had been packed. Word had spread that Miller Calabro, the quiet former civil engineer who'd bought the old Patterson property up on the northern peaks, was going to present some kind of building proposal. People filled the wooden benches, more out of curiosity than civic duty. Mayor Sterling sat at the head table with 4 council members flanking him, all of them wearing expressions that ranged from mildly interested to openly skeptical. Miller had stood at the podium, rolling out his blueprints across the presentation table. The paper crackled in the silence. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Chen," he began, nodding to the lone woman on the council. "I'm here to submit plans for a primary residence to be constructed at elevation 8,400 feet on Lot 47, commonly known as Glacier Ridge." "Glacier Ridge?" Mayor Sterling leaned forward, squinting at the blueprints. "That's nothing but ice and rock up there, son. You can't build on a glacier." "I'm not building on it," Miller said calmly. "I'm building in it." The murmur that went through the crowd was like wind through dry grass. Someone in the back laughed outright. Council member Frank Morrison cleared his throat. "I'm sorry. Did you say in the glacier?" "That's correct. I plan to excavate a habitable chamber within the ice formation and construct a log cabin structure anchored directly into the glacial walls. The dwelling will be completely enclosed within the ice, utilizing the glacier's natural thermal regulation properties to maintain year-round climate control." For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Mayor Sterling started laughing. It wasn't a mean laugh. Not at first. It was the kind of laugh you'd give a child who'd just suggested building a castle on the moon. "Mr. Calabro, I appreciate creative thinking, but this is, well, it's absurd. You want to live inside a glacier? That ice could shift, crack, crush you in your sleep. And the cold. My God, you'd freeze to death come winter." Miller had expected this. He pulled out a sheaf of calculations and temperature readings. "Actually, Mr. Mayor, the interior temperature of a glacial formation of this size and age remains constant at approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. That's warmer than the exterior temperature for 5 months of the year and significantly cooler for the other 7. The ice is stable, compressed over thousands of years. My geological survey indicates minimal movement, less than 1 millimeter per year." Mrs. Chen frowned at the blueprints. "But why? Why would anyone choose to live in ice when you could build a perfectly good house on flat ground?" "Because flat ground doesn't provide protection from extreme weather events," Miller said, his voice taking on an edge he couldn't quite suppress. "The climate data shows increasing temperature volatility, hotter summers, colder winters, more severe storms. A traditional wood frame house is vulnerable to all of it. A dwelling within a glacier is protected by millions of tons of stable ice. It's naturally insulated, requires minimal energy for temperature control, and provides access to pure meltwater from an underground spring system I've already mapped." Councilmember Rodriguez spoke up from the end of the table. "You're talking about climate change. I'm talking about preparing for reality." "This is Oakhaven," Mayor Sterling said, spreading his hands. "We've been building ranch houses on these flats for 100 years. Good, solid, wooden homes. You're asking us to approve what amounts to a cave dwelling. It's not. It's not civilized, Mr. Calabro." Miller felt his jaw tighten. He'd known this would be difficult, but the casual dismissal still stung. Civilized is being alive when the weather turns against you. Civilized is having water when the wells run dry. Civilized is thinking beyond next week. "The wells aren't going to run dry," Morrison said with a chuckle. "We've got the aquifer. It's been here longer than we have." "The aquifer that's dropping 3 inches per year?" "That aquifer?" The room went quiet again. Miller could see he'd struck a nerve. Everyone knew the water levels had been declining, but nobody wanted to talk about it. It was easier to pretend everything was fine. Mayor Sterling gathered the blueprints and pushed them back across the table. "Mr. Calabro, I'm going to level with you. This council isn't going to approve a residence built inside a glacier. It's dangerous. It's impractical. And frankly, it makes the town look bad. What are people going to think when they drive through and hear we've got residents living in ice caves?" "They'll think we're smart enough to adapt," Miller said quietly, "or crazy enough to throw their lives away." Sterling stood, signaling the meeting was over. "I'm sorry, but the answer is no. If you want to build in Oakhaven, build a proper house. On proper ground." Miller had stood there for a long moment, looking at the 5 people who held the power to approve or deny his vision. Then he carefully rolled up his blueprints. "The property is outside town limits," he said, "which means I don't actually need your approval. I was presenting this as a courtesy, and to put the plans on record, but I'll be building regardless of what this council thinks." The mayor's face had gone red. "Now see here." "Good evening, gentlemen." Mrs. Chen. Miller had walked out of that town hall with every eye in Oakhaven burning into his back. Dixie had been waiting in their truck, and when he'd climbed in beside her, she'd simply asked, "How bad?" "Bad," he'd said. "They think we're insane." She'd started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot while people streamed from the building, already gossiping. Then let's go be insane together. Now, sitting in the cabin those same people had mocked, Miller looked at his wife across the table. Her defiant expression hadn't changed, but he could see the exhaustion around her eyes. The building process had nearly broken both of them. The work had started in early spring, when the glacier was at its most stable. Miller had rented industrial ice-cutting equipment, the kind used for ice sculpture competitions, but scaled up for serious excavation. The machine looked like a chainsaw married to a mining drill, and it screamed like a demon when it bit into the ancient ice. Dixie had worked beside him every day. They'd start before dawn, when the ice was hardest, cutting into the glacier's face in carefully measured increments. The blue ice had fallen away in massive chunks, each piece thousands of years old, filled with trapped air bubbles that popped and hissed when exposed to outside temperatures. "This feels wrong," Dixie had said on the third day, watching another section of ice crash to the ground. "Like we're destroying something sacred." Miller had shut off the cutter and removed his protective goggles. His face was red from cold and exertion. "We're not destroying it. We're becoming part of it. The glacier has been here for 10,000 years. It'll be here long after we're gone." They'd carved for 6 weeks straight, creating a chamber 40 feet deep and 30 feet wide. Then came the real challenge, anchoring the cabin's structure into ice that could shift or melt. Miller had designed a system of titanium bolts drilled deep into the glacier's most stable sections, each one sealed with a special epoxy that bonded with ice at the molecular level. The bolts would hold the cabin's frame, allowing the structure to float within the ice chamber while remaining secure. Hauling the logs up the mountain had required borrowing every favor Miller had ever earned. A few locals, curious despite themselves, had helped transport the timber. Most had just shaken their heads and placed bets on how long the Calabros would last before the glacier killed them. Dixie had been the one to insist on the window. "I need to see out," she'd said. "I can't live in complete darkness." Miller had argued that windows were a thermal liability, but he'd lost that argument the way he lost most arguments with Dixie. They'd installed a triple-pane glass window facing the valley, sealed with industrial gaskets designed for Arctic research stations. The day they'd fitted it into place, and Dixie had looked out at Oakhaven spread below them, she'd started crying. "What's wrong?" Miller had asked, alarmed. "Nothing," she'd said, wiping her eyes. "I just realized how small it all looks from up here. The town, the gossip, all of it. We did this, Miller. We actually did this." They'd finished the cabin in September, just as the first autumn cold started to bite. The interior was sparse but functional. A sleeping loft, a main living area with the handmade table, a kitchen space with a wood stove vented through a chimney that ran up through the ice and terminated above the glacier's surface. The spring water Miller had discovered while drilling the foundation bolts flowed into a cistern that gravity fed to their sink. Everything worked. Everything held. Oakhaven had watched and waited for the structure to fail, for the ice to shift, for the cold to drive the Calabros back down to civilization. When none of that happened, the mockery changed from concerned to contemptuous. If the Calabros wanted to live like hermits in their ice castle, let them. Good riddance. Miller pulled himself back to the present, to Dixie sitting across from him in the cabin that had proven every doubter wrong. Outside their window, the heat continued its assault. "The first transformer went down about an hour ago," Dixie said, nodding toward the valley. "Did you see it?" Miller had seen it. The flash of electrical failure, the section of Oakhaven that went dark even in the middle of the day because the air conditioning units had all been running at maximum capacity. The power grid wasn't designed for this kind of sustained load. Down in Oakhaven, people were just starting to realize this wasn't a normal hot spell. For the first 48 hours, they'd treated it like an excuse for a vacation. Kids ran through sprinklers that turned the precious water into rainbows. Adults sat on porches with cold beers, commenting that it was hot. Sure, but nothing they couldn't handle. The general store sold out of ice cream and electric fans. The community pool was packed from dawn to dusk. But then the temperature had stopped climbing at a reasonable level. It hit 105, then 108, then held steady at 110 with no signs of dropping even after sunset. The elderly Mrs. Patterson had been taken to the clinic with heat exhaustion. The Thompsons' dog had died, left too long in a yard without shade, and that first transformer had blown with a sound like a gunshot, cutting power to 30 homes. Now it was day 2, sliding into day 3, and Oakhaven was starting to panic. Miller watched through the window as smoke rose from the southern edge of town. At first he thought it might be a barbecue, someone still pretending this was just an extended summer day. Then he saw the flicker of actual flames. "Dixie," he said quietly, "we've got fire." She came to the window, and they watched together as the Petersons' wooden porch swing, sun-dried and heated past its tolerance point, spontaneously combusted. The flames spread to the porch boards, then up the side of the house. Someone was running with a garden hose, but when they turned it on, only a trickle came out. The water main was failing. Over the next hour, they watched 3 more fires break out. Dry lawns ignited from discarded glass that focused sunlight like a magnifying glass. A shed full of paint cans exploded from the heat buildup. The volunteer fire department responded, but their trucks moved slower than usual, and the water pressure from their hoses was noticeably weaker than it should have been. The aquifer that Mayor Sterling had been so confident about was dropping faster than anyone had predicted. Wells that had flowed freely for decades were now producing mud and air. The town's main reservoir was evaporating in the brutal heat, the water level dropping visibly with each passing hour. Dixie turned away from the window, her face pale. "They're dying down there." "Not yet," Miller said. "But soon, if this keeps up for 7 days like the forecast says, the death toll is going to be significant. Elderly, very young, anyone with respiratory issues. We have to help them. We will, when they come to us. And if they don't come, if they're too proud?" Miller looked at his wife, seeing the conflict in her eyes. She'd never forgotten the cruelty, the way the town had treated them. But she'd also never lost her fundamental goodness, her inability to watch people suffer even when they deserved it. "They'll come," he said. "Pride doesn't survive heat stroke." As if to punctuate his words, another section of Oakhaven went dark. The second transformer had just failed, and this time the electrical flash was followed by a small explosion that sent black smoke billowing into the white-hot sky. The town was burning, dying of thirst, and the sun wasn't even close to finished with it yet. Miller and Dixie stood at their window in the cool blue sanctuary of the Glacier, watching civilization unravel 1 degree at a time. The cabin around them hummed with its own quiet life, the ice creaking softly as it always did, the spring water flowing, the temperature holding steady at a survivable 55 degrees. Below them, Oakhaven learned what it meant to build for comfort instead of survival. And above them, the ancient glacier that everyone had called a death trap proved to be the only thing standing between the Calabros and the fury of a sun that had decided to show the world exactly who was in charge. Day 3 was just beginning, and the real test was still to come. The sound reached them before the sight did. Engines straining in low gear, grinding up the mountain road that was never meant to handle this kind of traffic. Miller stood from the table where he'd been reviewing his water rationing calculations and moved to the window. Dixie joined him, and together they watched the caravan emerge from the heat shimmer like a mirage, solidifying into terrible reality. 12 vehicles, maybe 15. Trucks mostly, a few cars that had no business attempting the steep grade. They crawled up the switchbacks, trailing dust and desperation. In the lead was Mayor Sterling's black pickup, and even from this distance, Miller could see how slowly it was moving, how careful the driver was being with every turn. "They're coming," Dixie said unnecessarily. Miller checked his watch. Day 5. He'd predicted day 3 or 4, but apparently Oakhaven's stubbornness had bought them an extra 48 hours of suffering. He wondered how many had died in that time. The radio broadcasts had stopped yesterday when the last radio station's generator had failed. "I'll get the rifle," Dixie said quietly. "Dixie." "I'm getting the rifle, Miller. We don't know what state they're in." She was right, of course. Desperate people did desperate things, and a town dying of thirst might not be in the mood for negotiation. Miller watched her pull the Winchester from its rack near the door, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. She'd grown up on a ranch, knew her way around firearms better than he did. The caravan took another 20 minutes to reach the base of the glacier. By then, Miller and Dixie were standing outside the cabin, just inside the blue archway where the temperature dropped 30 degrees in the span of 10 feet. Miller held his thermometer, the one he'd been recording data with since they'd moved in. It read 54 degrees where they stood. Behind them, deeper in the glacier, it would be even cooler. The vehicles stopped in a ragged line, engines ticking as they cooled. Doors opened and people spilled out, and Miller felt his chest tighten at the sight of them. These weren't the smug, mocking faces he remembered from the town council meeting. These were the faces of the truly broken. Mayor Sterling looked like he'd aged 20 years. His face was sunburned to the point of blistering, his lips cracked and bleeding. "Missus," Chen stumbled as she climbed out of the passenger seat, caught by Frank Morrison, who didn't look much better. There were children too, their faces flushed and listless, carried by parents who could barely walk themselves. Miller counted roughly 40 people, not the whole town, but a significant portion, probably everyone who could still move, who hadn't already succumbed to heat stroke or dehydration. Mayor Sterling walked forward, stopped about 20 feet from the glacier entrance, close enough to feel the cool air flowing out, far enough to show he understood this wasn't his territory anymore. "Miller," he said, and his voice was a ruined rasp. "We need help." Miller didn't respond immediately. He was doing calculations in his head, running the numbers on water supply and thermal load, and how many bodies the glacier could support before the heat they generated started to destabilize the ice. Beside him, Dixie shifted her grip on the rifle, not pointing it at anyone, but not hiding it either. "The temperature in Oakhaven?" Miller asked. "115 in the shade," Sterling replied. "126 in direct sun. The water main's bone dry. We've got 7 dead, another dozen who won't last the night without water and cooling." 7 dead. Miller had known it would be bad, but hearing the number still hit hard. The forecast says 2 more days of this heat. "We know." Sterling swayed slightly, caught himself. "We can't survive 2 more days down there. We need water. We need." He looked past Miller at the blue ice, at the dark coolness beyond. "We need shelter." Someone in the crowd called out, voice cracking with thirst. "Please, my daughter, she's only 4. Miller felt Dixie's eyes on him, felt the weight of 40 lives pressing against the calculations he'd made so carefully. The glacier could support maybe 20 people safely for a short period. 40 was pushing into dangerous territory. The heat from that many bodies, the moisture from their breath, the waste they'd generate, all of it could destabilize the delicate thermal balance he'd worked so hard to maintain. But 7 were already dead, and he could see more dying in front of him right now. "Miller," Dixie said softly, not pushing, just acknowledging that this was his call to make. He looked at Mayor Sterling, at the man who'd laughed at his blueprints and called his home uncivilized. Sterling's eyes were hollow, beaten. There was no mockery left in him. The heat had burned it all away. "You can come in," Miller said, "but there are rules, non-negotiable rules. If anyone breaks them, everyone leaves. Understood?" Sterling nodded so quickly Miller thought he might pass out. "Anything. We'll do anything. First rule, no more than 20 people inside the glacier at any time. The rest will have to rotate in shifts for cooling and water. Second, you move slowly and deliberately. No running, no sudden movements. The ice is stable, but it's not indestructible. Third, you take only the water I give you, when I give it to you. We have enough to keep everyone alive, but not enough for waste. Fourth, the children and elderly get priority for the coolest areas. The able-bodied stay near the entrance where it's warmer." Miller paused, making sure Sterling was tracking all of this. The mayor nodded. "Fifth and final rule. When this is over, when the heat breaks and you go back down to Oakhaven, you're going to listen to what I found while building this place. and you're going to do something about it. That's the price of salvation. Do you accept these terms?" "Yes," Sterling said immediately. "God, yes, we accept." Miller looked at Dixie, who lowered the rifle and nodded. Together, they stepped aside, opening the path into the glacier. What happened next was controlled chaos. Miller organized the townspeople with the precision of a military operation, directing the most critical cases into the cabin itself, where Dixie began administering water in careful, measured amounts. Too much too fast would make them sick. He sent the children to the stable area where Copper had once sheltered, now converted into a cooling station with blankets spread on the ice. The able-bodied adults stayed near the entrance in a rotation system Miller established on the spot. 30 minutes in the cool air, then back outside to make room for others. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable. The key was keeping the glacier's core temperature stable, while still providing enough relief to prevent more deaths. By nightfall, the system was working. The children had stopped crying, their fevers brought down by the blessed coolness. The elderly were resting in the deeper chambers, their breathing steadier. No one had died in the last 6 hours, which felt like a victory. Miller found Mayor Sterling sitting just inside the entrance, his back against the blue ice wall. The man was drinking water slowly, methodically, the way Miller had instructed. "Thank you," Sterling said. "I know that doesn't mean much coming from me, but thank you." Miller sat down across from him, felt the cold of the ice seeping through his pants. "There's something you need to know. Something I found when I was drilling the foundation bolts for this place." Sterling looked up, his sunburned face curious despite the exhaustion. "I hit water about 40 feet down," Miller continued. "Not meltwater, but a flowing spring. Strong flow, pure, cold. I traced it using surveying equipment, followed it through the ice formation." He paused, making sure Sterling was paying attention. "It feeds directly into Oakhaven's aquifer. This glacier, the one you thought was useless, is the source of your town's entire water supply." Sterling's eyes widened. That's impossible. The aquifer is fed by snowmelt from here," Miller interrupted. "From this glacier. But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what I found when I mapped the full spring system. There's a diversion point about a mile north of town. Someone installed industrial pumping equipment and rerouted a significant portion of the flow. Who would? Apex Agribusiness. They've got that facility northwest of town, remember? The one they said would bring jobs and prosperity. They've been stealing your water for the last 3 years. Not all of it, but enough that when a drought hits, when demand spikes, the aquifer can't keep up." Sterling stood up so fast he almost fell over. "Those bastards. Those goddamn bastards. The drought, the wells failing, it's all been them." "Not all of it. The heat is real. Climate change is real. But your town would have survived this if your water supply hadn't been compromised. I've got documentation, survey maps, flow rate calculations, everything you need to prove it in court. Why didn't you tell us? Before all this?" Miller looked at him steadily. "Would you have believed me, the crazy man living in the glacier, or would you have dismissed it like you dismissed everything else I tried to tell you?" Sterling had no answer to that, which was answer enough. The next 2 days passed in a blur of careful management and constant vigilance. Miller barely slept, monitoring the glacier's stability, adjusting the rotation schedules, ensuring everyone got enough water and cooling without pushing the ice past its limits. Dixie worked beside him, her initial resentment toward the townspeople softening as she saw the children recover, saw families reunited in the cool shadows. On the 7th day, the heat broke. It happened just before dawn, when the temperature was usually at its lowest point. Instead of the relentless warmth that had held steady all night for the past week, there was actually cool air flowing down from the peaks. Miller stepped outside the glacier entrance and felt real wind on his face for the first time in a week. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 95 degrees. By evening, it was down to 80. The heat wave was over. The townspeople emerged from the glacier like survivors from a bunker, blinking in the sunlight that no longer felt like a weapon. They loaded back into their vehicles slowly, still weak but alive. All of them alive now. Miller and Dixie had lost no one during the 5 days of refuge. Mayor Sterling was the last to leave. He stood at the Glacier entrance, looking at Miller with something that might have been respect. "We'll file charges against Apex," he said. "First thing. And we're going to rebuild differently. Stone instead of wood, better insulation, covered walkways, the kind of infrastructure that can handle extreme weather." "Good," Miller said. "And we'd like to keep this place operational. As an emergency shelter, pay you and Dixie to maintain it, staff it, maybe expand the cooling capacity. The town council voted on it this morning. Unanimous." Miller glanced at Dixie, who gave a small nod. "We'll consider it." Sterling extended his hand. Miller looked at it for a long moment, then shook it. The mayor's grip was weak but sincere. "I was wrong," Sterling said simply. "About everything. The glacier, the cabin, you. I'm sorry it took people dying for me to see that." "Don't apologize to me," Miller replied. "Apologize to them." He gestured toward the vehicles where the townspeople waited. "And then make sure it never happens again." Sterling nodded and walked away, climbing into his truck with the careful movements of someone who'd learned how fragile life could be. The caravan started up, engines turning over, and began the slow descent back to Oakhaven. Miller and Dixie stood at the entrance to their Glacier home, watching them go. The air was genuinely cool now, autumn returning to the mountains as if the past week had been some kind of fever dream. But the scorch marks on Oakhaven were real enough, visible even from up here. The town had survived, but it bore scars. "Think they'll actually change?" Dixie asked. Miller put his arm around her shoulders. "Some will, some won't. But enough of them will that it matters." Over the following months, Oakhaven rebuilt. Not the same way, but smarter. Stone buildings with thick walls appeared where wooden ranch houses had burned. The town drilled new wells and installed a water tower with triple the capacity of the old one. They sued Apex Agribusiness and won, forcing the company to shut down their illegal diversion and pay damages that funded the reconstruction. And high on the northern peaks, the glacier cabin that everyone had called Calabro's Icebox was officially designated as an emergency cooling center and high-altitude research station. Miller accepted the position as director, and Dixie became the site manager. They expanded the habitable area carefully, creating additional chambers that could shelter up to 50 people during extreme weather events. The Glacier Castle, as the children started calling it, became a monument to foresight. School groups hiked up to tour it, to hear the story of the man who'd built in ice while everyone else built in wood. To learn the lesson that survival wasn't about comfort, but about preparation. Miller never gloated, never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The blue ice spoke for itself, ancient and patient and endlessly cold, a reminder that nature didn't care about tradition or pride or what seemed civilized to people who'd never had to fight for their lives. On cool autumn evenings, Miller and Dixie would sit at their window, looking down at Oakhaven with its new stone buildings and covered walkways. The town had learned, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. And when the next heatwave came, because there would be another, climate being what it was, the town would be ready. Not because they were forced to flee to the glacier, but because the glacier had taught them how to think differently about survival. The mockery had turned to respect. The death trap had become a sanctuary. And Miller Calabro, the madman with his blueprints and his thermometer, had proven that sometimes the most insane thing you can do is be right when everyone else is wrong. The glacier groaned softly in its eternal slow dance with gravity, and inside its blue heart, two people who'd refused to build where it was easy stood watch over a town that had finally learned to build where it was safe.